There is an island off the northwest coast of Scotland that the British government does not like to talk about for very long. It sits in the cold grey water of the Outer Hebrides, about a mile and a half from the tip of the Gruinard Bay Peninsula, and from a distance, it looks like any other small Scottish island. Green hills rolling down to rocky shores, seabirds wheeling above the water. The particular kind of bleak, windswept beauty that the Scottish coast does better than almost anywhere else on Earth. It is called Gruinard Island, and it is roughly 520 acres of land that the British government once turned into one of the most lethal places on the surface of the planet. Deliberately, methodically, and with full knowledge of what they were doing. In 1942, scientists from Porton Down, the British military research establishment that has been quietly responsible for some of the most disturbing scientific work carried out in the name of national security, traveled to this remote island in the Scottish Highlands and conducted a series of experiments that would contaminate it so thoroughly that it would not be declared safe for another 48 years. They brought sheep, they brought bombs, and they brought Bacillus anthracis, the bacterium that causes anthrax, one of the most persistent and lethal biological agents ever studied. What they did on that island, what they found, what it meant, and what it still means today, is a story that cuts to the heart of some very uncomfortable questions. Questions about what governments do in secret when they believe the stakes are high enough. Questions about what we actually owe to the land and to the people who live near it. Questions about whether 48 years of effort and millions of pounds of formaldehyde is actually enough to clean up a place that was deliberately seeded with a bacterium that can survive in soil for decades. Subscribe right now if you want to understand the world as it actually is, including the parts that are deliberately kept quiet and the places that are marked on maps but are never supposed to be visited. Let us go. To understand what happened on Gruinard Island, you need to understand where the world was in 1942. The Second World War was not going well for the Allies. The fall of France had happened 2 years earlier. The German military machine was operating across Europe and North Africa with a ruthlessness and efficiency that seemed, from the perspective of 1942, genuinely unstoppable. The Japanese had struck Pearl Harbor. The siege of Leningrad was underway. Stalingrad was coming. The world was in a kind of darkness that is genuinely difficult to imagine from the relative safety of the present. And in that darkness, governments began thinking about weapons they would never have considered in peacetime. The British government had reason to believe that Nazi Germany was developing biological weapons. The intelligence was imperfect, as intelligence always is, but it was persistent enough to be taken seriously by people in positions of authority who did not have the luxury of waiting for certainty. If Germany had a working biological weapon and Britain did not, the consequences were unthinkable. And so the thinking went, as it always goes in these situations, that the only responsible thing to do was to develop one first. Not necessarily to use it, the argument ran, but to have it, to understand it, to be ready. The pathogen they settled on was anthrax, and the choice was not arbitrary. Anthrax has properties that make it extraordinarily dangerous as a weapon. The bacterium, Bacillus anthracis, forms spores when conditions are unfavorable to its survival, and these spores are essentially indestructible by normal environmental processes. They do not die when exposed to sunlight. They do not die when the ground freezes. They do not die when the ground dries. They sit, dormant but fully viable, in the soil for years, for decades, potentially for far longer than that. There are documented cases of anthrax spores surviving in soil for 60, 70, 80 years or more, and still being capable of causing infection when conditions allowed. The spores are also small enough to be inhaled, and inhaled anthrax, pulmonary anthrax, is the most lethal form of the disease. Without modern treatment, it kills somewhere between 80 and 90% of the people it infects, and it kills them relatively quickly, within days of exposure. It is the kind of pathogen that, when you read its properties written out in a list, makes you understand immediately why governments were interested in it, and also why the idea of deliberately releasing it anywhere causes a particular quality of alarm. Gruinard Island was selected for the tests, for reasons that seem, from a distance, almost offhand in their practicality. It was remote. The prevailing winds came off the sea, which meant that any airborne dispersal of spores during a test would be carried out over the water rather than over inhabited land. It was uninhabited, having been used for sheep grazing and farmed only intermittently. The mainland was close enough to allow practical access for the research team, but not so close that the island was surrounded by population centers. It was, in the language of people who think about these things, an acceptable risk. the farmers who had grazed sheep on the island, and the local people who lived on the shores of Gruinard Bay, and who had been connected to this patch of ground for generations, were not consulted. They were told the island was being requisitioned for wartime use. That was the full extent of what they were told. The scientists from Porton Down who arrived on the island in the spring of 1942 were serious, skilled people. They were not monsters in the cartoon sense. They were researchers who understood exactly what they were handling, who wore the protective equipment available to them, who documented their work carefully and with the kind of methodological rigor that scientific training instills. They were also people who had made a decision, or had the decision made for them by the institutional logic of wartime research, that what happened to this island and to the animals on it was an acceptable price for the knowledge they needed to acquire. They tethered sheep at various distances from a central point on the island. They detonated bombs that had been filled with anthrax spores, designed to aerosolize the contents on explosion and create a cloud of invisible, lethal particles that drifted downwind from the detonation point. They watched what happened to the sheep. They recorded which animals died, how quickly, at what distance from the blast, under what wind conditions. They were calibrating the weapon, working out the mathematics of death at scale, calculating how many bombs dropped from what altitude over what area of a city or military installation would produce what level of casualties. The sheep died. They died of anthrax, and they died in the numbers and at the distances that the scientists had calculated they would, which was, from the perspective of the research program, a success. What happened next is one of those details that sounds almost impossibly careless until you remember that these were people under wartime pressure who were thinking primarily about the immediate military problem and perhaps not quite as carefully as they should have about the longer-term consequences of seeding an island with one of the most persistent biological agents known to science. The carcasses of the sheep that died in the tests were buried on the island, buried in the soil that had already been contaminated by the spore-bearing bombs, and then the tests continued. There were multiple rounds of experiments on Gruinard Island in 1942 and 1943. The exact number is not entirely clear from the historical record that has been made public, partly because the records were classified for decades, and partly because even after declassification, the full documentation is scattered and incomplete. What is clear is that the island was deliberately and repeatedly contaminated with anthrax spores over a period of months, to a degree that the scientists themselves knew at the time would make the island dangerous for years to come. At the end of the experiments, when the scientists packed up their equipment and left the island, a decision was made. The island would be left alone. It was contaminated, deeply and persistently contaminated, but the contamination would be contained by the island's geography. The sea was the fence. Nobody lived there. Nobody needed to go there. The island would simply be left, and the problem of what to do with it would be a problem for later. Later turned out to be a very long time. The war ended in 1945. The island remained contaminated. The Cold War began. The island remained contaminated. The 1950s passed, and the 1960s passed, and the Apollo program put men on the moon, and the world invented the integrated circuit, and the Vietnam War was fought and ended, and the island remained contaminated. The people who had lived on the shores of Gruinard Bay, who could see the island from their houses and their boats and their fields, continued to know that it was there, and that it was not safe, although what exactly not safe meant was something the government was not very forthcoming about for most of those decades. In 1981, nearly 40 years after the tests, scientists returned to the island to take soil samples. What they found was not surprising to anyone who understood the properties of anthrax spores, but it was sobering in the way that confirmation of a feared thing is always sobering. The island was still contaminated, significantly contaminated. The spores had not died. They had not dispersed. They had not broken down. They were sitting in the soil of Gruinard Island exactly as they had been left in 1942 and 1943, patient and dormant, and entirely capable of causing disease if given the opportunity. The government, which had been quietly hoping that the problem might have resolved itself through the normal processes of natural degradation, now had a very inconvenient set of soil samples and a growing sense that the matter could not be left entirely alone forever. Then came 1981, and a development that changed the calculus entirely. A parcel bomb arrived at a government building. Inside it, along with the explosive charge, was a container of anthrax-contaminated soil from Gruinard Island. A group calling itself Dark Harvest Commando claimed responsibility and delivered a manifesto with it, stating that they had removed hundreds of kilograms of contaminated soil from Gruinard Island and would continue to deliver parcels to government and military locations until the island was decontaminated. A second package was delivered, this time to the Conservative Party conference in Blackpool, which was considerably more alarming from the government's perspective than a package at an anonymous office building. The Dark Harvest Commando appear to have been connected to Scottish nationalist politics and to a specific anger about the way the British government had treated a piece of Scottish land, contaminating it for decades, and then leaving the problem as a permanent feature of the Scottish coast, without any apparent urgency about resolving it. Whether you find their methods defensible or not, their action had the practical effect of making the decontamination of Gruinard Island a political priority rather than a distant aspiration. Proposals began to be developed. The question was, how do you decontaminate an island that has been seeded with anthrax spores to an unknown depth in the soil across an area of hundreds of acres? The spores are not on the surface where they can be swept up or washed away. They have worked their way into the soil matrix, carried by water and by the movement of the earth itself over the decades since they were deposited. You cannot simply spray the surface with disinfectant and declare the problem solved. The spores are everywhere throughout the soil column to some uncertain depth. The solution that was eventually settled on was extraordinary in its scale and its audacity, and also, in retrospect, in the questions it leaves open about whether it actually worked as completely as was subsequently claimed. In 1986, a contractor was hired to carry out a decontamination program. The program involved removing the topsoil from the most heavily contaminated areas of the island and treating the remaining soil with a solution of formaldehyde and seawater, pumped through a network of perforated pipes and sprinklers installed across the island's surface. The formaldehyde, which is a powerful disinfectant capable of killing anthrax spores under the right conditions, was applied in volumes and concentrations calculated to penetrate the soil to the depth at which contamination was believed to exist. The word "believed" is doing significant work in that sentence. Because nobody could say with certainty exactly how deep the spores had penetrated over 40 years in the soil, nobody could say with certainty that the formaldehyde solution, applied from the surface, was penetrating effectively to every contaminated zone, given the variability of soil type and density and water retention across an island of 520 acres. Nobody could say with certainty that every contaminated spot had been identified in the preliminary survey, given that the surveys were done by sampling, not by testing every square meter of the island's surface. What they could say was that after the treatment, a series of soil samples from around the island failed to show viable anthrax spores. On the basis of those samples, the island was declared safe. In 1990, 48 years after the first bombs fell, the government paid compensation to the family that had previously owned the island and sold it back to them. The island was declared decontaminated. The land had been returned. A small flock of sheep was introduced to the island as a practical demonstration of its safety. The sheep did not die of anthrax. This was taken as confirmation. Gruinard Island was declared clean. And here is where the story gets genuinely uncomfortable, in a way that goes beyond the discomfort of the original contamination, which is already deeply uncomfortable. The declaration that Gruinard Island was safe rested on a series of assumptions and a sampling strategy that scientists both inside and outside the government acknowledged at the time was incomplete. Soil testing is not like testing water, where you can sample a reservoir and make reasonable inferences about the whole body. Soil is heterogeneous. The distribution of contamination in soil depends on an enormous number of local variables, the specific composition of the soil at each point, the drainage patterns, the movement of organisms through the soil, the effects of frost and thaw over decades. A sampling program that covers even a substantial fraction of an island's surface can miss contaminated pockets. The anthrax spores that were deposited on Gruinard Island in 1942 and 1943 were not distributed evenly. They were concentrated in the areas around the detonation points, with the density falling off as distance from the blast increased. But which areas were most heavily contaminated, and to what depth, was information that was not perfectly known even to the scientists who conducted the original tests, because the detailed records of exactly where every test was conducted and exactly what quantities of spores were used were not all available to the decontamination team 44 years later. Some had been lost. Some were classified in ways that made them difficult to access. Some of what was known was uncertain even at the time it was recorded. The formaldehyde treatment was effective in the areas where it was applied at sufficient concentration and where the soil conditions allowed adequate penetration. Whether it was effective everywhere across the island is a question that cannot be answered with complete certainty by the sampling that was done, because the sampling was not complete. This is not an accusation. This is a straightforward description of the limits of what was practically achievable. You cannot test every square inch of a 520-acre island. You can do your best sampling and treat the areas you are most confident about, and apply the most effective treatment available, and then make a judgment about whether you have done enough. The British government made that judgment in 1990 and declared the island safe. Scientists who have reviewed the decontamination program subsequently have generally concluded that it was carried out as competently as the state of knowledge and available technology allowed. They have also noted that the confidence in its completeness is bounded by the limits of the sampling program and the inherent uncertainty about the original distribution and depth of contamination, which is to say, in plain language, that it was probably fine, but probably is not certainly, and anthrax spores are not the kind of thing where you want to be in the territory of probably. The island was not open to general public access after decontamination. It remains privately owned by the family that received it back in 1990. There is no ferry service. There is no organized tourism. The island sits in Gruinard Bay, visible from the shore, and the people who live in the houses around the bay can see it, as they have always seen it, small and green, and apparently innocuous in the gray water. But the story of Gruinard Island is not a self-contained historical episode. It opens out into a much larger story about what the British government and many other governments were doing with biological weapons research in the mid-20th century, and about what that research has left behind in the landscape and in the bodies of the people who were exposed to it, often without their knowledge. Porton-Down, the establishment that conducted the Gruinard experiments, has been operating in some form since 1916, when it was established on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire to research chemical weapons in the context of the First World War. Over the following century, it has been the site of research into chemical agents, biological agents, and various countermeasures to both, operating under successive names and organizational structures, but maintaining a continuity of purpose and personnel that makes it one of the longest-running military research establishments in the world. The history of what was tested at Porton-Down and in associated facilities like Gruinard Island is only partially visible to the public even now. Significant portions of the records remain classified. Others have been released through Freedom of Information requests and historical reviews, but the released records are not complete, and there are acknowledged gaps that are attributed to various causes: the destruction of records at various points, the classification of material that has not been reviewed for release, the simple administrative chaos of a very old institution that has been through multiple reorganizations. What is known from the public record is troubling enough. Human subjects were used in tests at Porton-Down over many decades. The consent and awareness of those subjects varied enormously over time, and in some periods was essentially non-existent. Veterans and servicemen were told they were participating in research into the common cold, or were given vague assurances that they were helping develop defenses against enemy weapons, without being told what specific agents they were being exposed to, or what the known risks were. Some of these people became ill afterward. Some died. The connection between their illnesses and their participation in the Porton-Down research program was denied or minimized for decades before being acknowledged, partially and reluctantly, through a combination of legal pressure and historical investigation. The most documented case involves servicemen who were exposed to nerve agents, specifically sarin and VX, in tests conducted during the Cold War period. A number of these men suffered serious and lasting harm. One, Ronald Madison, died in 1953 after being exposed to sarin during a test at Porton-Down. He was 20 years old. His death was attributed at the time to heart failure associated with the test exposure, but it was classified and hidden from his family and the public. It was not until 2004, more than 50 years later, following a long legal battle, that an inquest jury found that Madison had been unlawfully killed. The government subsequently paid compensation to veterans and families who had been affected by the experiments. This is the context in which the Gruinard Island tests took place. Not an aberration, not a rogue project carried out by scientists exceeding their authority. Part of a systematic program of weapons research that was conducted with the full knowledge and authorization of the British government, that used animals and land and, in some cases, human beings as its test subjects, and that operated under a level of secrecy that made accountability essentially impossible for decades. The secrecy was justified. when it was justified, by the genuine urgency of the threats that Britain faced. The First World War justification for chemical weapons research was real. The Second World War justification for biological weapons research was real. The Cold War justifications for nerve agent testing were real, in the sense that the Soviet Union was conducting equivalent or more extensive research, and the threat of a conflict in which such weapons might be used was not imaginary. The people who authorized these programs were not, for the most part, indifferent to the suffering they caused. They were people who believed, usually sincerely, that the alternative to having these capabilities was something worse. But the sincerity of the belief does not eliminate the harm caused by acting on it. The sheep died on Gruinard Island. The island was contaminated for half a century. The people who had used the island lost access to it. The people who lived near it lived with the knowledge of what was there, and with the uncertainty about what that meant for the water around them and for the land adjacent to it. The servicemen who were exposed to nerve agents at Porton Down suffered real injuries, and in some cases died, and their families spent decades without knowing why or being able to seek any accountability. The harm was real regardless of the intentions that produced it. There is another dimension to the Gruinard Island story that gets less attention than the tests themselves, and it concerns what happened in the years immediately after the island was used, and what the existence of the contaminated island meant for the communities living nearby during those 48 years. The farmers and crofters of the Gruinard Bay area, the people whose relationship with that stretch of coast and water was the defining fact of their economic and cultural life, were dealing with a contaminated island in their immediate vicinity for nearly 5 decades. The contamination was not spreading to the mainland in any measurable way, so far as the government's monitoring suggested, but the monitoring was itself limited and not entirely transparent to local people. What was the risk to sheep that might swim to the island, as sheep sometimes do in the Scottish Islands? What was the risk from birds that might fly between the island and the mainland, potentially carrying contaminated soil on their feet or feathers? What was the risk from the formaldehyde treatment when it was eventually carried out, to the marine environment of the bay, to the fish, to the shellfish that people harvested from those waters? The answers the government provided to these questions were generally reassuring. The monitoring did not show evidence of spread. The treatment chemicals were diluted below harmful levels in the bay. The risk to mainland communities was not elevated above background. But reassurance is not the same as transparent information, and the people being reassured were the same people who had had their land requisitioned without full explanation, and who had been living for decades adjacent to an island that the government would not let them approach. Trust, once broken in the way that the original requisition and the subsequent silence about the contamination broke it, does not restore easily. The communities of the Scottish Highlands and Islands have a long historical relationship with the British state that involves, among other things, the clearances of the 18th and 19th centuries, when Highland communities were forcibly displaced from their land to make way for sheep farming and later for hunting estates, a process that depopulated entire regions and destroyed ways of life that had existed for centuries. The commandeering of Gruinard Island fitted, for many people in the area, into a longer pattern of the British state treating Scottish land and Scottish people as resources to be used in the service of priorities decided elsewhere. This is not a paranoid reading of the situation. It is a historically grounded one. The clearances happened. They were catastrophic for the communities they displaced. The requisitioning of Gruinard Island happened without meaningful consultation with the people who had used it. The decision to leave the island contaminated without any decontamination effort for more than 4 decades was made by people who did not live in Gruinard Bay and who did not have to look at the island every day knowing what was there. The Dark Harvest Commando, whatever one thinks of their methods, were expressing something that had a legitimate foundation in the actual history of how the British state had related to this particular piece of Scottish land and to the people connected to it. The Gruinard Island episode also sits within a global context of biological weapons research and development during the 20th century that extended far beyond Britain's shores and produced consequences that are still unresolved in multiple places around the world. The United States operated an extensive biological weapons program from the Second World War until 1969, when President Nixon ordered its termination and the destruction of the stockpiles. The program was centered at Fort Detrick in Maryland, but extended to multiple test sites, including Horn Island off the coast of Mississippi, where anthrax and other agents were tested in ways that have some parallels to what happened at Gruinard. The cleanup and decontamination of these sites has been a decades-long process, and questions about the completeness of the decontamination remain in some cases. The Soviet Union ran the most extensive biological weapons program in history, operating under the cover of a nominally civilian organization called Biopreparat, right through the Cold War and into the post-Soviet period. Vozrozdeniya Island, also known as Renaissance Island in the Aral Sea, was the primary outdoor testing site for Soviet biological weapons and was contaminated with anthrax and other agents on a scale that dwarfs what happened at Gruinard. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the island was eventually connected to the mainland by the shrinking of the Aral Sea, which was itself a catastrophe of Soviet engineering, the question of what was in the soil of that island became a public health concern for the newly independent states of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Decontamination efforts were carried out in the early 2000s with American assistance, but the completeness of those efforts is uncertain. Japan conducted biological weapons research and testing in Manchuria during the Second World War under the auspices of Unit 731, a program that was vastly more extensive than any Western equivalent and that included human experimentation on prisoners of war and on Chinese civilians on a scale that was genuinely atrocious. The sites of those experiments, in what is now northeastern China, were contaminated with multiple biological agents. Questions about that contamination and about the long-term fate of the pathogens introduced to the soil and groundwater of the region have been raised by Chinese researchers, but not comprehensively answered. The pattern that emerges from all of these cases is consistent and troubling. Governments, believing themselves to face existential threats, developed biological weapons programs. These programs required testing. Testing required release of biological agents into the environment. Environmental contamination resulted. The contamination was, in many cases, minimized or denied. When it could not be denied, it was addressed with whatever decontamination measures were available. Measures whose completeness was always bounded by the limits of the technology and the sampling strategies used to assess them. The contaminated sites were then declared safe, or at least safer, and the problem was considered resolved, or at least resolved enough. The places remain. Gruinard Island remains. It sits in Gruinard Bay with its green hills and its rocky shores and its seabirds, and it has been declared safe, and there are no obvious signs that it is dangerous. The family that owns it grazes sheep on it occasionally. The sheep do not die of anthrax. The island looks like any other small Scottish island. But the soil of that island carries a history that the landscape itself cannot erase. The formaldehyde has degraded. The treatment chemicals are long gone. What persists is the rock and the earth, and whatever the earth contains. The official position is that the contamination has been effectively addressed. The scientific literature on anthrax spore survival in soil suggests that this is plausible but not certain. The gap between plausible and certain is narrow, but in the case of anthrax, it is a gap that merits attention. There is a word in Gaelic, the language that has been spoken along the Highland coast for over a millennium, that does not have a precise English equivalent. The word is dúchas, and it refers to something like a deep, inherent connection between a people and a specific piece of land. A connection that is not merely legal or economic, but is woven into identity and memory and belonging in a way that makes the land not just a place to live, but a part of what a person is. It is the concept that underlies the particularly fierce attachment to land that characterizes highland and island communities, the attachment that made the clearances so devastating not just economically, but existentially. Taking people off their land was not, in this framework, merely displacing them. It was amputating something. The people who had connections to Gruinard Island, the farmers who had used it, the families whose grandfathers had grazed cattle on it before the requisitioning, the fishermen who had pulled their boats up on its shores, experienced the government's treatment of the island through this framework. The island was not just real estate, it was dúchas. Its contamination was not just an environmental problem, it was a violation of something that the government, operating from a very different framework about what land is and what it is for, did not fully understand it was violating. The restitution, when it came, was monetary. The family received compensation and the land was sold back. Money changed hands. The government fulfilled its legal obligations as best it understood them. What could not be bought back or compensated for was the 48 years during which the island's dúchas had been interrupted, the generations during which the connection between the land and the people connected to it had been severed by contamination and classification and official silence. This is not unique to Scotland or to Gruinard. It is a pattern that recurs wherever governments have used land in this way, wherever military or industrial contamination has severed the relationship between a community and the landscape that defines it. The communities that lived near nuclear test sites in Nevada and Kazakhstan and the Pacific Islands, the people of Bikini Atoll, whose island was used for nuclear weapons testing and who have never been able to return to it in any meaningful, permanent way, despite repeated government promises. The farming communities living near chemical manufacturing sites, whose products contaminated local water and soil for decades before the contamination was acknowledged. In all of these cases, the legal and financial resolution, when it comes, resolves the narrow legal question without touching the deeper loss. What makes Grunard Island specifically worth knowing about, beyond its place in this broader history, is what it represents about the texture of knowledge and secrecy and public trust in a democratic society. Britain is a democracy. It has been a democracy, with varying degrees of imperfection, for long enough that its democratic credentials are not in serious dispute. And yet within this democracy, a program of biological weapons research was conducted that involved contaminating British land, keeping that contamination secret from the British people for decades, exposing servicemen to lethal agents without meaningful consent, and then, when the time came for accountability, providing it in the minimum form necessary to contain the political damage. This is not an argument that democracies are secretly authoritarian or that democratic governments are equivalent to dictatorships. They are not. The difference between living in a democracy and living under authoritarian rule is real and significant and matters enormously. But the existence of the democratic form does not guarantee that everything done in its name is done with appropriate transparency and accountability. Democracies have security establishments. Security establishments operate under conditions of secrecy. Secrecy can protect genuine operational necessities, and it can also protect the institutions themselves from scrutiny of decisions that were wrong or harmful. Distinguishing between the two is not always easy, especially from the outside, especially decades after the fact. The history of Grunard Island is a case study in what can happen to a democracy's relationship with its own people and its own land when the security establishment is insulated from scrutiny for too long. The decisions made in 1942 were made by people who believed they were acting in the national interest and who may well have been right that the general direction of biological weapons research was necessary, given what they knew or believed about the German program. But the specific decision to use Grunard Island, the specific decision to leave the contamination in place for 4 decades without either cleaning it up or being transparent with the public about the reasons for not doing so, the specific handling of the claims of servicemen harmed in related programs, these were decisions that could have been made differently within the constraints of genuine security necessity, and the fact that they were not reflects the institutional culture of the security establishment more than it reflects any external necessity. The island is there now, and it will be there for as long as there is an island to be there, which in geological terms means a very long time. The soil has been treated, the samples have been taken, the sheep have grazed, the official declaration of safety has been made and stands. And all of that is probably sufficient, in the sense that the risk from Grunard Island to the people of Grunard Bay is probably not elevated above background, and the island is probably not going to generate a public health crisis at any foreseeable point. But probably is still the operative word, and the reason it is still the operative word, rather than certainly, is that the original contamination was done more thoroughly and more persistently than the decontamination effort could be. You can seed a landscape with anthrax spores faster than you can find and neutralize every one of them afterward. The asymmetry between contamination and decontamination is fundamental. Destruction is easier than repair. This is true of anthrax spores in soil. It is true of most forms of environmental contamination, and it is true, in a different but related sense, of the damage done to public trust when a government uses land and people as instruments of military research without adequate transparency and accountability. You can attempt to repair it. You can pay compensation and sell land back, and issue statements of regret, and hold inquiries, and release documents that were once classified, and provide some measure of justice to people who were harmed. Britain has done some of these things in connection with the Grunard episode and with the Porton Down experiments. It has not done all of them, and what has been done has generally been done more slowly and more reluctantly than the people seeking accountability were entitled to expect. The repair is never complete. Not because complete repair is inherently impossible, but because the nature of the original harm was to take something that cannot be fully restored. The sheep on Gruinard Island in 1942 cannot be given back their lives. The 48 years during which the island's connection to its community was severed cannot be given back. The 20-year-old serviceman who died at Porton Down in 1953 cannot be given back his life. The families who lived with questions and uncertainty and health problems for decades while the government denied or minimized any connection cannot have that time returned to them. This is the hardest thing about this kind of history, not the original decisions, which were made under conditions of genuine pressure and genuine uncertainty by people who were not, for the most part, indifferent to the harm they were causing, but who had been convinced that the harm was justified by the stakes. The hardest thing is the subsequent decades of concealment and minimization and institutional self-protection that prolonged and compounded the original harm in ways that were not justified by any security necessity, that were motivated by the institutional desire to avoid accountability rather than by any genuine operational requirement. The contamination of Gruinard Island was a decision made in 1942. The 48 years of secrecy and the inadequate response to the concerns of affected communities and servicemen were decisions made and remade across 5 decades by multiple governments and multiple sets of officials, none of whom can be individually characterized as the villain of the piece, but all of whom participated in a pattern of institutional behavior that prioritized the interests of the institution over the interests of the people the institution was supposed to serve. That pattern is not unique to Britain and not unique to biological weapons research. It is a tendency that exists within security and military establishments across democratic systems, the tendency to treat secrecy as a value in itself rather than as an instrument of genuine operational security, to use classification as a tool for avoiding accountability rather than for protecting genuine sensitive information, to respond to the legitimate claims of people harmed by institutional decisions with the minimum necessary acknowledgement rather than the transparent accounting they are entitled to. Gruinard Island is still there. You can see it from the A832 road that runs along the shore of Gruinard Bay, the little road through the highland landscape with its hills and its lochs and its particular quality of light on the water that makes the Scottish Highlands one of the most beautiful places in the world when the weather is cooperating, and one of the most dramatically gray places in the world when it is not. The island sits in the bay, green and small and ordinary looking, and if you stop your car and look at it, you are looking at a place that carries a very extraordinary history in a very ordinary face. There is no sign at the roadside to tell you what happened there. There is no memorial. There is no museum. There is nothing to indicate, for a driver who did not already know, that this particular island in this particular bay is different from the hundreds of other small islands that dot the Scottish coast. The landscape keeps its secrets better than any government classification. The sea keeps going. The birds keep flying. The hills keep their silence. The island does not announce what it is. It does not need to. The story is there in the soil, in the long record of what was done and what was left and what was eventually attempted by way of repair. The story is there in the official documents that have been released, and in the gaps between them where the documents that have not been released would be. The story is there in the accounts of the local people and the affected servicemen, and the scientists who conducted the original tests, and the scientists who conducted the decontamination, and the politicians who had to face the consequences of decisions made by politicians who came before them. It is a story about what happens when the machinery of the state, acting with the sincere belief that it is serving the national interest, makes choices that leave marks on the land and on the people connected to it that persist for far longer than the original emergency that justified the choices. It is a story about the gap between the stated values of a democratic society and the actual practices of its security institutions when those institutions are insulated from scrutiny. It is a story about the particular quality of harm that comes